Dark clouds drift over a vast East African plain. In the distance, drums beat rhythmically. A narrator's voice fades in, deep, urgent, knowing. At the dawn of the 20th century, something began to stir in the heart of German East Africa. From the coastal towns of Kilwa to the central plains of the Matumbi Hills, murmurs of rebellion grew louder. But this wasn't just any rebellion, it was spiritual, ancestral, and fueled by a desperation that cut through generations. The seeds of the Maji Maji Uprising were sown not just in suffering, but in the raw, collective memory of people whose way of life was being ripped apart by a brutal colonial machine. The Germans had established a regime of harsh economic exploitation. Under the guise of civilization, they forced local populations into growing cotton, a crop with no value to them, through a ruthless system of forced labor. People were beaten, villages were razed, women were abused, and children were torn from their families. Taxation, land dispossession, and cultural humiliation became everyday realities. It was a slow-burn oppression, deadly, calculated, and relentless. But history tells us that when a people are pressed to the edge, they either break or rise. In the shadows of forgotten forests and sacred shrines, elders began whispering ancient incantations. Warriors spoke of unity across tribal lines, something once thought impossible. And in a land torn by regional identities, something miraculous happened. Dozens of ethnic groups, Ngoni, Matumbi, Bena, Pagoro, and more, prepared to unite in defiance. Why now? Why this time? What made 1905 the year that East Africa decided to defy one of Europe's most powerful empires? The answer lay in a man named Kinjekitile Ngwale, a spiritual medium, a prophet, and for many, a savior. But before we meet him, we must understand the agony that made his message so irresistible. This was not just a political rebellion, it was a sacred war, baptized in Maji. Water said to be bulletproof. The world would come to call it the Maji Maji Rebellion, but for those who lived it, this was not just a rebellion. It was redemption, revolution, revelation. And what followed would shake the continent, forever. A swirling blend of rainwater, herbs, and sacred roots being poured into a carved calabash. Soft chanting echoes in the background as mist rolls across an ancestral shrine. To understand the heartbeat of the Maji Maji Uprising, we must meet the man who turned water into a weapon, Kinjekitile Ngwale, also known as Bokero. A humble man from the Matumbi Hills, he vanished into the wilderness in 1904. When he returned weeks later, his eyes had changed. He claimed to have been possessed by the spirit of Hongo, a powerful ancestral deity. With his newfound authority, Kinjekitile preached a radical doctrine. The time had come for Africans to throw off German rule, not with guns, but with Maji, sacred water. This Maji was no ordinary water. Infused with millet grains, castor oil, and sacred medicine, it was believed to render the wearer impervious to German bullets. More than a physical shield, it was a spiritual contract. Those who drank it committed themselves wholly to the rebellion. Kinjekitile's genius wasn't in arms or military strategy, it was in uniting dozens of divided tribes under a shared mythos. For the first time, the Ngoni, Zaramo, Yao, and Matumbi saw themselves not as rivals but as kin in a divine war for liberation. Across East Africa, whispers of Bokero's message spread like wildfire. Elders led purification rituals. Warriors bathed in Maji, painted their faces with white ash, and invoked the names of the ancestors. Children sang freedom songs. Entire villages became war camps overnight. The rebellion had taken on the aura of prophecy. This wasn't just politics. It was apocalypse. It was renewal. A second baptism. And Kinjekitile stood at the center of it, not as a warlord, but as a messenger of the gods. But with all revolutions fueled by faith, doubt lingered at the edges. Could water really stop bullets? Were the spirits truly on their side? In some villages, skeptics whispered warnings, but they were drowned out by a tidal wave of belief. In the eyes of many, to doubt was worse than death. The Maji didn't just bind warriors to a cause, it dissolved fear, replacing it with certainty, even in the face of machine guns. What unfolded next was both miraculous and tragic. The Maji gave ordinary people the courage to face impossible odds, but it also led them into the jaws of a war they could not win. And yet, the fact that so many believed, so fiercely, is what makes the Maji Maji Uprising not just a chapter in African history, but one of the most powerful testaments to the human spirit's refusal to be conquered. A fluttering German imperial flag overlays a map of East Africa. The sound of marching boots fades into the clatter of gunfire, as black smoke rises over a burning village. When the first blow fell, it was swift and symbolic. On July 31, 1905, warriors aligned with Kinjekitile and Gwale torched a German cotton ginning factory at Nandite. What followed was a cascading wave of rebellion across German East Africa. Over 20 distinct ethnic groups, from the coast to the inland forests, launched coordinated assaults on colonial outposts, mission stations, and symbols of foreign rule. German officials were stunned, not just by the scale, but by the unity of the resistance. It was as though the land itself had turned against them. At first, the rebels achieved stunning victories. They captured rifles, expelled tax collectors, and disrupted colonial supply lines. But these early triumphs would provoke a brutal counteroffensive. The German Empire, determined to crush the uprising and maintain its colonial grip, dispatched thousands of reinforcements, many of them battle-hardened Askari, African soldiers under German command, led by white officers with orders to annihilate. The military campaign that followed wasn't war. It was retribution. Under Governor Gustav Adolf von Gotzen, the German military launched a scorched earth campaign. Entire villages suspected of aiding the rebellion were burned. Wells were poisoned, food stores destroyed, and fertile farmland razed to the ground. Women and children were not spared. Crops were uprooted not just as punishment, but as policy, to starve the resistance into surrender. It was psychological warfare wrapped in imperial arrogance, designed to send a message: no one defies the Reich and lives to tell the tale. The spiritual armor of Maji met the cold steel of German firepower. And slowly, tragically, belief collided with bullets. The rebels' bravery was undeniable. But their resources were not. As German forces tightened their grip, Kinjekitile was captured and executed in August 1905, barely a month after the uprising began. But even in death, his spirit lived on, as resistance flared in different regions over the next 2 years. Some fought with spears, others with stolen rifles, but all fought with a fire that no execution could extinguish. Yet with every act of German retaliation, the land itself began to turn hostile, not against the invaders, but against its own people. Starvation set in. Water grew scarce. Entire communities withered, not by war alone, but by the systematic removal of their means to live. The rebellion was no longer a battle for freedom, it was a struggle for survival. And in the face of such devastation, even the most faithful began to ask, was the Maji a miracle, or a miscalculation? A haunting aerial pan across scorched earth and abandoned homesteads. Emaciated figures walk slowly beneath a sun-scorched sky. In the distance, vultures circle over the remnants of what was once a thriving village. What began as a war of hope and resistance soon descended into a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. With the rebellion spreading across regions like Alanga, Kilosa, and Mahenge, the German strategy shifted from military suppression to total annihilation. The goal was no longer just to defeat the rebels, it was to break the soul of the land. And the method was as old as empire: starve them out. Farms were burned. Irrigation systems destroyed. Livestock slaughtered or seized. Grain stores were looted and torched. The Germans aimed not just to punish but to make survival itself an act of resistance. The policy of scorched earth, cleansing the land of all potential support, left no room for neutrality. Entire populations were cut off from their own food sources. The same villagers who once danced and chanted around Maji calabashes now crouched in silence, staring at empty bowls and dying kin. Estimates suggest that between 200,000 and 300,000 Africans died, not in battle, but from hunger, thirst, and disease. For every warrior cut down by a German bullet, dozens more perished from famine. The land became a graveyard, not marked by tombstones but by silence, the eerie quiet of rivers without laughter, markets without trade, and fields without harvest. Children born during this time were often unnamed, their lives too uncertain to be celebrated. What's chilling is that this wasn't a byproduct of war, it was deliberate. Governor von Gotzen's infamous orders made clear that the rebellion must be extinguished at the root. He viewed the destruction of food sources as an acceptable, even necessary, tactic. German records spoke of villages pacified and populations reduced, euphemisms for mass suffering. It was one of the earliest instances of colonial warfare turning into a war of extermination, long before such tactics would resurface in Europe's own 20th century tragedies. Yet, amid the ash and starvation, stories of resilience endured. Villagers found ways to hide food underground. Children were smuggled across territories to safety. Rebels dug in, determined to outlast not just bullets, but hunger. And in whispered songs passed down through generations, they remembered those days, not only for their horrors, but for the courage it took to fight back with nothing but hope, hunger, and a name, Maji. A parched field, once green with crops, now lifeless. A lone child digs near a dry streambed. In the distance, smoke rises from the remains of scorched homes. A haunting silence fills the air. By late 1905, the nature of the Maji Maji resistance had changed. The open battles were fewer. The Maji, once seen as a divine shield, had failed to stop German bullets. But the rebellion did not end, it mutated. As the German Empire intensified its campaign, it embraced a weapon even more ruthless than rifles, hunger. Governor von Gotzen authorized a scorched earth strategy so severe it erased not just villages, but livelihoods. The goal was not just to defeat the enemy, but to starve them into submission. Villages suspected of sheltering rebels were torched. Entire harvests were uprooted before ripening. Grain stores were looted or burned. Fruit trees were felled, wells were poisoned, and salt was poured into the soil. Famine became a deliberate instrument of war. Crops once destined to feed children were reduced to ash. In some areas, families ground tree bark into powder just to survive. Mothers boiled roots and leaves into weak, bitter broths. Children cried themselves to sleep from hunger. It was not just a war against people, it was a war against life itself. And yet, amid the ash and starvation, stories of resilience endured. Villagers buried food underground or hid it inside termite mounds. Families risked their lives to cross enemy lines in search of hidden streams and sacred groves. Children were smuggled across colonial zones and hidden in caves. Songs became signals, shadows became shields. Even in their worst hour, the spirit of Maji refused to die. Those who had nothing left clung to hope, and to each other. But the cost was catastrophic. By the time the rebellion was officially crushed in 1907, an estimated 250,000 to 300,000 Africans had perished, not from gunfire, but from starvation and disease. It was one of the first genocidal acts of the 20th century on African soil, and yet it is rarely remembered as such. Survivors were left not only to mourn their dead but to rebuild from dust. The German Empire, unrepentant, declared order restored, and resumed its colonial grip. Still, whispers of the Maji Maji lived on, in lullabies, in morning chants, in the quiet defiance of those who had witnessed horror and endured. The war had taught them that even when the world forgets you, memory can be resistance. And in every village that dared to rise again, the name Maji carried not just tragedy, but testimony. A dimly lit archive room. Dusty files labeled 1905-07 remain unopened. A single beam of sunlight falls on an untouched folder stamped Maji Maji, classified. The pages within rustle faintly, as if trying to speak. How does a war that cost over 250,000 lives vanish from the pages of global history? The Maji Maji Uprising, one of Africa's earliest and most unified acts of resistance against European imperialism, was deliberately muted. Unlike the Zulu Wars or the Boer conflicts that made headlines in Europe, the tragedy of the Maji Maji remained largely undocumented outside East Africa. This was not an accident, it was imperial design. The German Empire, embarrassed by the scale of the resistance and the savagery of its response, chose silence over scrutiny. Official German reports downplayed the rebellion as tribal unrest, while minimizing death tolls and ignoring the deliberate use of famine as a weapon. Military officers were decorated, not investigated. European newspapers largely echoed colonial narratives, depicting Africans as irrational savages overcome by superstition, led to slaughter by magic water and madness. Even post-World War I, when Germany lost its colonies to Britain and Belgium, no reparations were made, and no tribunal examined what had happened in East Africa between 1905 and 1907. It was as though the blood had evaporated with the rain. Meanwhile, in Africa, the silence took a different form. Families who survived the rebellion bore their grief in whispers. Under colonial rule, open remembrance was dangerous. Songs about Maji were banned. Gatherings of elders became suspect. For decades, knowledge of the uprising was passed down orally, through parables, lullabies, and secret rites. The trauma became intergenerational, etched in memory but starved of recognition. A war this devastating left not just broken bodies, but silenced voices. Even in independent Tanzania, the Maji Maji Uprising didn't immediately receive the commemoration it deserved. The legacy of colonial education meant that many East Africans learned more about European wars than about the sacrifices of their own ancestors. Only in recent decades, through the work of African scholars, community elders, and cultural revivalists, has the true magnitude of Maji Maji begun to re-emerge. But the question lingers, why did the world choose to forget? In forgetting Maji Maji, the world erased a crucial lesson about faith, unity, and resistance in the face of overwhelming brutality. But the silence can be broken. Every film, every story, every mention is a blow against erasure. And in telling this story now, we echo the voices of the past, voices that were never silent, only silenced. A split-screen collage. On one side, a statue of Kinjekitile Nguyen wreathed in flowers. On the other, a colonial-era illustration portraying him as a deranged sorcerer. Between them, flickering images of different historians debating before an open flame. History is rarely agreed upon, it is contested, reshaped, and sometimes weaponized. And so it is with the Maji Maji Uprising. In one telling, it is a glorious, if tragic, stand for African dignity, a unified, spiritual revolt against colonial tyranny. In another, it is a cautionary tale of delusion and fanaticism, led by a false prophet whose magic cost thousands their lives. The figure at the heart of this divide is Kinjekitile Nguyen. Was he a visionary martyr or a dangerous mystic? The answer depends on who's telling the story. Colonial records branded Kinjekitile as a madman. German officials dismissed him as a sorcerer, peddling superstition to the desperate. They used his Maji doctrine as proof of African irrationality. Evidence that the continent needed European order and civilization. This portrayal, steeped in racial arrogance, allowed the colonizers to justify the genocide that followed. And yet, ironically, it was this very Maji that forged the first major multi-ethnic coalition in East African resistance history. African historians and cultural custodians see Kinjekitile differently. To them, he was a genius of symbolic warfare, using faith and myth to bind people across language, tribe, and geography. He understood that against modern weapons, military strength alone would fail. What was needed was belief, unyielding, transcendent belief. His Maji may not have stopped bullets, but it shattered psychological chains and ignited a collective defiance that even death could not quench. In that sense, his magic worked, just not in the way colonizers imagined. There are also critiques from within African intellectual circles. Some argue that the spiritual fervor of the uprising may have blinded communities to practical resistance strategies. Others question whether Kinjekitile should have foreseen the devastating consequences of mass belief in an invincibility that wasn't real. These voices don't deny his impact, but they complicate it. They remind us that even revolutionaries can be flawed, and that resistance is never simple. Heroism, like history, resists clean lines. Still, across Tanzania today, Kinjekitile Ngwale is honored not as a cult figure, but as a national ancestor. Monuments stand in his name. Maji Maji Day is marked in remembrance. And his story, once buried under colonial disdain, now stirs the conscience of a generation seeking to reclaim Africa's silenced narratives. In the end, whether you see him as prophet or provocateur, one truth remains: he gave his people something worth dying for, and the world something worth remembering. A serene East African landscape at dawn. Children walk past a monument inscribed with the words, Maji Maji. In the background, elders pour libation at a remembrance ceremony while soft traditional music plays. More than a century has passed since the last fires of the Maji Maji Uprising were extinguished. Yet the echoes of that war still rumble beneath the soil of Tanzania, and in the memory of its people. For many, Maji Maji is more than history, it is a symbol of unity, courage, and spiritual resistance. In a continent often portrayed through the lens of division, the Maji Maji rebellion stands out as a remarkable moment when diverse ethnic groups set aside their differences and rose together against a common oppressor. Today, the uprising is taught in Tanzanian schools not only as a military event but as a foundational narrative of national identity. Monuments and museums in places like Sunhaya and Ifakara preserve the memory of those who died. Men, women, and children who resisted with no promise of victory. Maji Maji Day, commemorated annually on July 31st, is more than a ritual, it's a national act of remembrance. For elders who still remember the stories passed down by survivors, the name Maji is sacred. For youth, it is a call to understand that freedom was never free. Yet, outside East Africa, the Maji Maji Uprising remains largely unknown. Western history books rarely mention it. It does not feature in global curriculums alongside the American Revolution, French Resistance, or India's Quit India movement. This erasure is part of a wider pattern, the tendency to marginalize African resistance narratives as isolated uprisings rather than legitimate struggles for self-determination. And so, the responsibility of remembrance has fallen to a new generation of storytellers, educators, and creators determined to rewrite the global narrative. Beyond remembrance, Maji Maji also invites us to confront deeper questions about the long-term impact of colonial trauma. The strategies used by the German Empire, famine, psychological warfare, cultural destruction, are not relics of the past. Their consequences live on in the economic challenges, political fractures, and identity crises that many African nations face today. But Maji Maji also reminds us of something more enduring, that no system, no matter how powerful, can fully erase the spirit of a people who dare to resist. And so, as we close this story, the question is not just what happened between 1905 and 1907, but what do we do with it now? Will we let it fade into silence again, or will we carry it forward, as truth, as memory, as mirror? The warriors of the Maji Maji Uprising fought with little more than water, hope, and a dream of freedom. That dream is not yet finished. It lives in every African voice that dares to tell its own story. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. Maji Maji, Africa's Forgotten War Against Empire is more than a story of rebellion. It is a rediscovery of a people's fight to reclaim their dignity, their land, and their future. It is a reminder that Africa's history is not merely one of colonization, but of fierce resistance, spiritual power, and unbreakable unity. In remembering Maji Maji, we honor those who refuse to be erased and restore a vital chapter to the narrative of global freedom movements. Let this not be the last time we say their names. If this story moved you, helped you learn something new, or made you think differently about African history, please like, share, and comment with your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss more powerful stories like this, stories that deserve to be told, heard, and remembered.